Hey, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hello to all, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Aya Ziada, and I'm AMP's newest advocacy director. I'm so excited to be here leading my first webinar with the organization on a very crucial topic, complicity with ethnic cleansing, how U.S. charities fund Israeli settlements. I'm looking forward to all that we're going to learn from our expert panel here today, and I hope that you all walk away informed and motivated to carry on the momentum in the fight for Palestinian rights. I'd like to begin by introducing my colleague and co-moderator, Tariq Khalil, who is our education coordinator.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whoever is tuning in. This is a very essential topic considering the political climate that we're in right now. And it's important that we really discuss this in a very serious way, because it's really not treated as such. And as a co-moderator, I'll be doing whatever I can to make sure that we get the right topics and the right information to the American public. Look, the Internal Revenue Service rules prohibit tax-exempt charities in the U.S. from funding activities that are illegal or contrary to public policy. That is to say, charitable organizations may not engage in behavior that is illegal or that violates U.S. public policy. And to quote from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's letter to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, quote, charitable purposes, by definition, cannot be unlawful or aid and abet serious breaches of international law or internationally recognized human rights, and US-based entities must be prohibited from using federal tax law to help perpetrate violations against Palestinians in direct contravention of both international law and the basic principles behind US charitable law, end quote. And the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, concluded that activities of settler organizations are one of the main causes of displacement in East Jerusalem. And as of 2020, OCHA reported that 218 Palestinian households in East Jerusalem, that's approximately 1,000 individuals, and around half of whom are children, have eviction cases filed against them and thus are at risk of displacement. Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan are mere microcosms of this project. And that is why this topic is of absolute importance for us to discuss. And I will now defer to Aya to introduce our speakers and move from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. This is definitely the time to be talking about this now more than ever. The settlement enterprise is never okay, but given that August specifically is a huge month for cities like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and the amount of people, the amount of Palestinians that are being threatened to be displaced from their homes, now is a very crucial time to be talking about this and to be educated about it. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists joining us today. We have Rasha Mubarak. Rasha is the founder and president of Unbought Power, and she's a Palestinian American Muslim community activist, consultant, political strategist, and leader. Rasha is a grassroots organizer and political advocate for national, statewide, and local political candidates in campaigns around civil rights, human rights, interfaith work, immigration rights, and Black and Brown liberation. We also have Diala Shamas, who is a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on challenging government and law enforcement abuses perpetrated under the guise of national security, both in the US and abroad. And finally, we have Lara Friedman, who's the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She's a leading authority on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of US Congress. Thank you all so much for being here today. So as Tariq kind of touched on, most of these nonprofits adhere to extremist Zionist ideologies and actively promote Israel's Judaization project in East Jerusalem. So these are the kinds of US-based charities that are funding Israel's illegal settlement enterprise. So I have a question for all three of you, and that is, this is against US policy. So how are they getting away with it? And why is it an important issue for the American public to be aware of? And we can start with Diala.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you all, and thanks for hosting such a timely event on this subject. we all are heeding the call from Palestinian communities in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan and elsewhere to ensure that we keep raising this issue, and particularly focusing on, as U.S.-based advocates, where the U.S. nexus to the what is essentially the ethnic cleansing project is, right? And so there has been a lot of focus on U.S. government funding to the Israeli military through the form of foreign aid. And I'm really excited that we're starting to pay some more attention to how private actors, including these so-called charities, are just as important part of the story, right? So, I think it's really helpful to have just like a bit more context in addition to what you set up. Like, one is just the scale of what we're talking about. There has been incredible investigative reporting, including counting back at least 10 years in the New York Times, in Haaretz, in a range of in publications looking into this question of US-based funding to 501c3s. And although we're talking about this a lot more now, there has also been a long history of Palestinian advocacy organizations, legal organizations, progressive groups in the US trying to also shine a light on this and also seeking some form of accountability, right? There's been a history of groups, maybe even AMP, I don't actually know, filing petitions, trying to get the IRS to look into these charities. So this is not a new issue, but it's getting renewed relevance today as we watch what's unfolding in Sheikh Jarrah, which has, a pretty direct nexus. I mean, many of the foundations that are operating in Sheikh Jarrah, including the Israel Land Fund, are primarily funded by US-based foundations that are 501c3s, that are also registered and regulated by the state, that are fueling and funding the settlement project in Sheikh Jarrah. In Sheikh Jarrah, it's the ILF. In Silwan, it's an organization called Ateret Kohanim. In Hebron, there's a whole range of these organizations. Wherever you kind of look in the West Bank, you can sort of find US, Israeli, quote, nonprofits that are funded by US foundations. What they fund is everything from, what they'll oftentimes call it, their mission is to sort of redeem land. That's the sort of euphemism for settlement expansion. It's the settlement movement's term for transferring land from Palestinian possession to Jewish possession. We also see organizations that literally support and fund the erection of structures, of physical structures and settlements. We also see them developing activities with a clear purpose and goal of preventing Palestinian populations from farming and from accessing their lands, which is, again, like a sort of necessary step in the process of then what happens is the state's expropriation of the land. So a really important feature here, not to get kind of too legal, I'm going to try to keep it light on the law, is this idea that these private organizations are actually sort of in cahoots, right, or in kind of a conspiracy with Israeli state. It's not, one couldn't be complete without the other. The Israeli authorities, I wouldn't say the state, because in the West Bank it's not the state, rely on these forms of private actors, literally laying their hands on the land, being funded, from the US, in order to then justify the process of expropriation. And it's this kind of private-public interaction that is like a key part of the story of how the settlement enterprise is executed, right? It's sort of a necessary part of the settlement enterprise. And so the question is, why isn't it regulated? Why isn't there more oversight? Why isn't the IRS looking into it? Ultimately, these are political questions. The IRS has been gutted in its enforcement capabilities for political reasons. There's also very interesting kind of reporting on that, not because of Palestine or Israel or settlement foundations, but for all sorts of other political considerations in the US. And I think we're seeing really interesting renewed calls to bolster the IRS's capabilities, right? As we're talking about tax evasion and taxing the rich, and progressives have been turning their sights on the IRS. So there's some really interesting opportunities there. And I would love to hear what Lara and Rasha have to say about some of the political dimensions. But I also just wanted to flag that, regardless of whether they're charities or not charities, any entity cannot be directly involved in these kinds of crimes, right? So we don't have to lean on the fact that they're charities and it's the IRS. Whether they were companies, whether there are any other kind of US-based actors, it is illegal to aid and abet international unlawful acts. And so we don't have to sort of necessarily entirely base our analysis or our argument on the fact that these are charities, although it's certainly an important aspect. It feels pretty obvious that if you're going to be charitable, you also can't engage in unlawful activity. So I'll just pause there.
Okay, thank you for that much needed detail. Absolutely. And Lara, same question to you. How are they getting away with this, and why is this an important issue?
So, first of all, again, thanks. I want to repeat Diala's thanks for holding this timely meeting, and thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel. I think Diala covered this really well. I mean, fundamentally, I think this boils down to a couple of things. One is political choices. It has been a decision politically to not look at this funding, at least to examine it, because there's been calls to examine this funding for years. The funding going to support settlement activities, particularly in East Jerusalem and Hebron, these sort of core settlement activities, dates back to the earliest era of the settlement movement, and then the wider funding, which goes through things like the Central Fund for Israel, these big organizations. This is a mainstay of the settlement movement and always has been. And there have been calls for years to investigate, and those have largely been ignored for years. I think it's also, though, important to emphasize the hook here, and I think it's really important, and I think the letter from Congresswoman Tlaib did this, focused on this correctly, is focusing, as Diala said, on the legality. I think it's really easy and tempting to say, well, this conflicts with US policy, and therefore. The problem there's a couple of problems. US policy, when it comes to settlements, is somewhat schizophrenic, has been for years. We say one thing, we do something else. It's also schizophrenic in the sense that, we just came off 4 years of the Trump administration where we had an administration that was avowedly pro-settlement, right? So you couldn't say it conflicted with US policy during that period. It's changed the policy there. And I guess more fundamentally, I would say, as someone who has engaged across the NGO spectrum for years with this question, making the argument based simply on or primarily on the policy argument, this is an approach which has tended, I think, to backfire on progressives. Saying that something, years ago, I talked to a lawyer from the ACLU about this when I had made an argument basically saying settlements are against US policy, why do we let them be funded by nonprofits? And this person basically said, well, what happens if someone decides to try to take away the nonprofit status of Planned Parenthood? Because at that time, Mexico City language, the US doesn't support any organizations that support or in any way educate on abortion. So you could see someone going after nonprofit status because of the policy, because it's not in vogue right now in US policy. A much stronger argument is framing this in law. Settlements are illegal under international law. That's the first point, and really pushing the US on why we don't recognize that and behave accordingly. And second of all, a lot of these charities are acting, at least allegedly, and this is something that various people have sought to work on in the past, maybe working in ways that actually defy US tax law very clearly, using tax-exempt funding for purposes that is clearly not tax-exempt. And this is something that I think the difficulty is that's a lot of work that has been, I think, a barrier to people raising these claims and challenging it, and a barrier to the IRS even considering taking it up. But fundamentally, this comes down to a political decision, which is why really putting the spotlight on the issue makes a difference. It's important and might result in that political decision eventually being changed.
Thank you for that, Lara. And I think it's very important to be reminded of the fact that before we get into any details, plain and simple, it's illegal under international human rights law. And that's the first and utmost argument that we should be making, for sure. Rasha, same question.
A year and a half into pandemic, and I still have trouble unmuting myself. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having us. I'm just enlightened by my peers on this call, and also mabruk to you on your new position. AMP's lucky to have you. And Diala and Lara, thank you so much for insight. I won't elaborate too much because they're the true experts here. And like they said, this is not new, right? From 2009 to 2013, U.S. Charities has funneled over $200 million to these Israeli settler organizations. Much of this is systemic, right? When we're talking about what does systemic oppression look like, it looks like the right-wing elected official, Arya King, who's a deputy mayor of Jerusalem and is currently a settler himself in Ras al-Amud, which is also in Jerusalem. He has been spearheading the efforts in Sheikh Jarrah, and he's actually the co-founder of Israel Land Fund that we keep referring to. So he started this in 2007, and they have a goal to continue to forcefully expel folks, to steal Palestinian land. And this is not new information. This is, again, like my colleagues have said, that this is illegal under international law. Much of like other settler colonial attempts, this is a way to, it's an extension of settler colonialism through the law, through being able to fly under the radar. Again, this isn't new. This has been going on for several years, right? But Palestinian advocates and activists globally have been calling on an investigation for the U.S.-based fueling of Palestinian displacement. So I think it's not so much that they're getting away with it in the sense of it's something unique. This is just an extension of how much Israel continues to perpetuate and really infiltrate within our own systems here in the U.S. that's already built on problematic foundations. So when, like a lot of what Lara said is that it's not necessarily like the policy and law here, because we've seen anti-Semitism laws passed, we've seen anti-BDS legislation passed. So a lot of the systemic, it's controlled by systemic laws, but also it is flying under the radar for those protocols. So it's being able to redirect the occupation of the Palestinian people and their land theft through tax-exempt organizations. And so I'm just happy to be with you all, and I'll stop there.
Thank you all for just really putting it all in context and connecting the dots for us. I really do appreciate it. And there were some organizations that were mentioned and highlighted. Atrit Kohanim was one of them, ILFCF. I mean, I just really want the public just to get an idea of who we're talking about here and the extremist lens from which these organizations operate. So for example, Atrit Kohanim's goal is to fulfill this is quote, fulfill a generations-old dream of rebuilding and securing a united Jerusalem, strengthening our Jewish roots and reestablishing the once thriving Jewish communities that were destroyed by Arab pogroms. And Atarit Kohanim specifically centers their colonization activities in my neighborhood, Silwan. That's where I'm from. I'm from Wadi Hilwa. And they've settled over 1,000 families. Can we speak to the extremist nature of these organizations? I mean, I can go on with various goals of these other organizations. I mean, they're very extremist in their language. So what do you, can we use that to further our activism and further public pressure to our representatives that, hey, regardless of the fact that this violates their 501c3 status, do you really want your tax dollars, or do you really want the organizations to use U.S. law, the benefits of U.S. law, to commit these types of extremist ideas? And I think the other left, I don't know what happened there, but Lara, can you tackle that, please? And then we'll go to Rasha.
Sure. So first, I want to reiterate, I don't want to disagree with you, but I do. I really think that framing this from the policy angle is not, I understand why it's attractive and it feels right. I don't think it is the right approach. I think it's very problematic. I can imagine a very similar conversation taking place in a webinar room where people are discussing how terrible it is that money is going for LGBTQ rights. And shouldn't we take away the nonprofit status of groups that fight for LGBTQ rights? Because that's what people do. They look at this. I think a much firmer place to stand on is the legality, is saying to people, look, this is U.S. taxpayers subsidizing activities that are blatantly illegal under international law, and that quite possibly, and this should be looked at, are actually clearly violating IRS tax law. I think that's a very firm place to stand. And when you think about the role that this has in, members of Congress are looking increasingly, particularly you think about the Biden administration, which talks about, restoring a normal kind of governance that respects international law and caring about human rights, which again, human rights is based on international law and human rights. And then saying, how do you square the circle when U.S. taxpayer funds are subsidizing groups that, and this is where it comes again to like looking at their own websites. I always joke, don't believe me when I tell you what a settler organization wants. Listen to the settler organization. They will tell you very clearly what they want. Hebron Fund will tell you very clearly what they want. El-Ad will tell you very clearly what it wants. And they're explicit. And you will find probably members of Congress who say, that's fine, I like that, go forth and do it. But for people who are looking at and care about the U.S. commitments to the post-World War II liberal world order, rule of law, international law, human rights, all of that, this is a problem. And it doesn't have to hang on the policy question. I don't mean to keep coming back to it, but I really think that is a dicey place to go. The legal argument is strong enough, and I think it's the right one.
Thank you, Lara. Tarek, do you want to repeat the question for Diala since her connection was cutting out?
Now that the significance of the question has been diminished, but the question was essentially, I quoted Atarit Kohanim's goal, and referred to the extremist ideologies from which these organizations operate, and should we focus on that as a tactic to further, the public pressure on our elected officials so that they can change course vis-a-vis Israel's settlement enterprise? Lara said no. So, Rasha, go ahead.
All right, did you say me?
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. I was like, let Diana go just in case we lose her again. But absolutely. I definitely hear Lada's point and absolutely in agreement with that. It obviously is in violation of international law. But here in the States, we are calling on them to commit to making like the public IRS procedures around 501c3 organizations. Credible information exists of involvements in violations. So to really look into that internationally, where they're violating, internationally human rights and serious breaches of this international law that Lara keeps referring to. Absolutely. And I think that we do here within the US want these members of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Representatives and Foreign Relations to really do a comprehensive investigation of how these are operating. And I know, Lara, you also mentioned Biden and his, call for human rights. And he also has talked to the issue of land grab and land theft, which is in contradiction of this. So that's why we're calling on his administration to really look into the violations of not just the international law, but the 501c3 statuses and policies, and to commit to assessing their compliance with these 501c3 organizations that are operating in this way, right? Especially when we're talking about charity organizations, people get tax exempt because they are protected, that they are in compliance with these international laws and also here these policies within the US borders. So I absolutely agree with Lara, but an extension to all of that, they need to look and review these policies that will help hold them accountable and help the investigation move forward. And I only believe that everything, in addition to the violations of the international law, really calling on these different committees and of course, a senator to really look into this investigation can help put a halt to how these organizations are operating and how they've already caused harm and trauma to these Palestinian families in Jerusalem. And like a lot of us have said today, they have one goal, they're very clear about it, it's increasing the Jewish demographic within Jerusalem and have been very successful. So yes to what Lara's saying, but I think as an organizer and a Politico, I think exhausting every aspect of this when we're calling on this investigation is important as well.
Yeah, and before we move it to Diala, I just really want to emphasize my point so that it's not missed. I mean, trust me, I know Article 49.6 like the back of my hand. You know, we need to emphasize international law and Israel's clear violations of them, humanitarian law and human rights law. I just presented this as an option, an additional option in addition to that, and not as the primary, obviously, not the primary course of action. Diala, did you miss that question, or we need to repeat it? You were kind of gone and back and gone and back.
So I'm in Palestine, and normally my connection is really good, but hopefully it'll hold for the rest of this webinar. I think I got. I mean, I know we're talking about this tension between the sort of policy arguments versus the legal arguments. Am I catching the kind of gist of it? Okay. Well, I mean, I think, you know, I agree with Lara. The public policy issue is tricky because the U.S. government has been just so awful around doing anything about settlements and sort of wishy-washy historically. But it is against U.S. public policy to discriminate. It is against U.S. public policy to violate international law norms, right? It is against you know, all sorts of fundamental principles, and so there are several ways of kind of getting at that without necessarily have to nitpick into this question of like what various administrations have said about settlements, because we sort of know that there's a long and sort of sordid history there, but I also do want to kind of emphasize, the significance of and the importance of really doubling down on some of the legal questions. And that's not to, you know, yes, I'm a lawyer, yes, I work at a legal organization, but we're fully aware of the fact that the law is ultimately a political tool, and we do need our decision makers, our politicians, our agencies to reshuffle their priorities, right? Their priorities have been all wrong historically. You know, Muslim American organizations know full well how the power of the state and the power of the IRS and the power of the Treasury can be wielded against really important political organizing in Muslim communities, charitable giving in Muslim communities, right? I don't need to emphasize this, you know, to an AMP audience, I'm sure, but that is a political calculus, right? And we need to be pushing to reprioritize and shift away from that political calculus and say, well, let's if this Biden administration is very serious about you know, getting its foreign policy to be aligned with international human rights and international norms, then this is a very good place to start, because we have, as we say in Arabic, al-'aynak ya tajir, these organizations that are so openly violating that are so open about their missions, right? As you noted on their websites, they're saying exactly what it is that they're trying to do. They're not shy about it. They're not trying to obfuscate it or hide it. And yet it is unlawful. It is in fact aiding and abetting apartheid. It is direct contribution to these international law violations. And so I do think that there's an opening now where there hasn't been historically. I do think that just because something was tried 10 years ago doesn't mean that it's not going to work now, because the political moment has shifted thanks to the organizing primarily by the communities on the ground in places like Sheikh Jarrah, but also in the US. And so I think that it is time to sort of re-raise some of these important questions, be careful in how we raise them, but also, you know, demand like answers in the ways that we haven't really been able to historically, using language of the law, but also understanding that ultimately, if we're going to get anywhere, this is going to be a political calculus made by some decision makers. And I just want to touch on one thing briefly, because there's been a lot of conversation about this, and folks who are maybe organizers tuning into this webinar might be thinking about, is we've talked a lot about the IRS, we've talked a lot about the sort of federal government and sort of its lack of movement on this question. But charities and corporations and companies, et cetera, are also regulated by states. And it's important to look locally, right? Where can we, so for example, many of these groups that we just mentioned, American Friends of Ateret Kohanim, the Central Fund of Israel, and many others are actually registered in New York because it's New York. So, that means that New York Attorney General has the ability, the power to, at the very least, look into these organizations and the allegations that we're raising, right? And so I think that there's opportunity there to sort of to raise issues with more than one sort of decision maker. I think the progress at the congressional level and the letter that Representative Tlaib put forward amongst many, with several other signatories, by the way, it wasn't just her, is really important at the federal level, but there's also important work that can be done at the local level, the state and the municipal level too, possibly.
Yeah, thank you, Diala, and thank you all so much for your insight. I think it all ties back together, right? Like Diala said, the momentum is shifting a lot. The dynamic has shifted. The political dynamic has shifted more in the last few months than it has in 10 years, probably, due to the nature of, just having the ethnic cleansing be live streamed, live broadcasted, and we're having everybody view it all over the world. So my question comes into tying the two together. So the law is important, and right now the political dynamic is important, and we should be exhausting every single resource that we have, every single way that we have in continuously shifting the dynamic. And I think where it gets complicated is the fact that just like we're having this webinar about this topic today, and not many of the American public knows that, these charities are big funders of the Israeli settlement enterprise. A lot of people also don't know, like you mentioned, yeah, that corporations are as well. It goes beyond just the US government. For example, the State Department just approved a $3.4 billion budget last Friday, including allocating weaponry and heavy lift cargo from companies like Lockheed Martin. And I'm in Colorado right now. We have one of the biggest sites of Lockheed Martin, right? So it's a very hard dynamic in that there's so many interconnected ways from here to Israel that motivate and aid and abet the Israeli enterprise. So how, my question ties the two together, how can we use the 501c3 issue, the corporation issue, and connect it to the political issue in that Congress approves annually a big military budget to Israel? And how do we connect to those two to use it to our advantage, or how does it make it harder for us to get somewhere? And we can go back to Lara.
That's a big question. It's a really good question. I mean, maybe it is the question. Look, I agree that there is a great opportunity right now. And it's an opportunity largely because the situation on the ground is so terrible and it's being live streamed. As you said, there's better coverage now of what is happening on the ground and what Palestinians are living through. And I mean, it does speak to the humanity of people everywhere, that when really faced with it, they're responding to it. And it suggests that this is an opening. I tend to think, and I'm not an activist and I'm not an organizer, and I'm not giving advice to activists and organizers. As someone who's been engaged in issues related to Palestine for many, many years, I think any visibility that can be brought to these issues is good, right? The sunlight disinfectant kind of thing. And I think this is a moment when there is an openness to learning because things are so bad and because there is so much attention on this. I think the 501c3 issue is one way to bring some sunlight to that, even if it is not specifically about saying, hey, we want you to strip away the nonprofit status of this organization, because again, I think how you go about that is dicey. but just shedding light on the fact, did you, Mr. Congressman, know that in your district is an organization that is engaged in supporting the most extremist settlements in the West Bank, who are building, illegally on Palestinian land and who are involved in attacks, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's value. It can be a teachable moment. Each of these things can have enormous power in helping people understand the dynamics on the ground aren't so simple as, as are presented to them, perhaps, when it comes to annual budget time and, do we support Israel zero daylight because Israel's in a tough neighborhood kind of talking points. It can be a really important corrective to those simplistic arguments. I don't know if there's a direct line between that and things like the efforts now to potentially maybe put some restrictions or conditions or oversight on aid to Israel. But I don't think there's any other route. I think the route to that, if it's ever going to happen, is going to come from educating the public to be more active and educating members of Congress. And those two things are inextricably linked. And that's where the activists and the organizers play such a critical role.
Go ahead, Diala.
I can just add something really quickly. I mean, I think on the connection, the connection is one of, how do we put it? Just, basic logic and appeal, right? The idea is to follow the money, and it's not, and we know that we're not going to be able to put pressure on the Israeli government and the Israeli authorities to change the way they act and behave, right? But we do know that, at least from the US, these are the ways in which we are directly involved in this Israeli project, right? And so that same logic applies whether you're talking about what we're funding, what our US tax dollars are doing, and then also what US private actors are doing, right? We all know this, we all have the image in our heads of, I believe his name is Jacob Fauci, the settler whom Al-Qud confronted and said, "You're stealing my house." And he said, "If I don't, someone else will," right? That is like this very palpable reminder that somebody from Long Island, right, is actually directly involved in removing the Al-Qud family from their home. And that sort of invites us to think about, like, how else, like, where else are those connections, those direct connections? And I think that's a lot more compelling in many ways than some of the language of moral obligations and like trying to get Israel to change its actions. So I don't see necessarily like a cohesive legal or political strategy to like that gets at the US government funding issue and then like the private actors issue, but I do think that they flow from the same sort of place of wanting to look at what it is that we are doing from the US. I'm not in the US right now, but what it is that we are doing as Americans that is fueling the settler enterprise. So I think that's really where you see the commonality.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good points. And again, I love how we keep coming back to education, especially having been one of the most taboo topics in the country for decades, where nobody was able to talk about, Palestine unless we were defending Israel. I think shining light on the issue in every avenue that we can is definitely what's going to keep the momentum going. Rasha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with everybody here. I think that coming from movement and being a grassroots organizer, that we were forced into the political world, and understanding that within the equation and pathway to freedom and liberation, that we have to exhaust all pockets, from the legal arm to grassroots organizing to coalition building to even how we message it. As organizing, there are strategy methods in place. So when you're doing power analysis, like, yes, the problem is Israel's occupation and oppression, but the issues that stem from the problem, right? The issues that stem from racism, the issues that stem from oppression and occupation, and being able to detect that so that you have more winnable issue-based campaigns. So when you're able to really articulate it, to contextualize it in that way and break it down, again, to everyone's point, education, is you're able to achieve these goals within movement, within the streets that translate into the halls of Congress, and then essentially getting to Secretary Yellen, right? So being able to be very specific with the issue, when you're hearing about the stories that are coming out of Sheikh Jarrah and the Silwan and eastern part of Jerusalem, being able to really break it down for folks that want to get involved on a grassroots level, and being able to say, okay, well, this is how, you know, people don't really understand when we're just saying blanket statements like, if you can prove that you're Jewish, you can attain Israeli citizenship, but having them understand what that pathway looks like and how the US is involved, aside from the 3.8 billion taxpayer dollars that we contribute to as a society and a community here, but like really being able to be specific, I think is very aligned with how movements and grassroots organizing are structured, because when you're able to identify the problem, the issue, and the target, it's more winnable. So absolutely, I think that this is a very strategic way, and I know that y'all have already mentioned it, but bringing light to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, bringing light to the forced expulsions, but also when people are lobbying their elected officials on a local, state, and federal level, they're able to say, bring a lot of context to how, you know, this is very much involved with us here in the States, right? And how we're helping funding. And I absolutely have to put it back on Lara. I think that their 501c3 statuses should be stripped, absolutely, because, you know, a lot of when you hear 501c3 statuses and folks that are donating to 501c3, it come from the nonprofit world, right? Is that people want to be able to donate to groups and agencies and orgs that have are free of biases potentially and free of harm. And settler organizations that are able to obtain a 501c3 status like this are far from that. So like you won't see, you know, white supremacist groups, many times it's very difficult for orgs like that to attain if they do really expose themselves at that. So a lot of this is education that leads to exposure, that leads to a lot of other strategy building.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to highlight, you know, a difficult, you know, a thing that I encounter in the education realm. As an education coordinator, you know, I mean, I focus on the history as well as the legalities and everything in between. And just trying to explain, you know, why East Jerusalem is considered occupied Palestinian territory. And, you know, why this whole dispute on Sheikh Jarrah should be removed from the scope that the media puts it in. Oh, it's just a property dispute between, you know, the Jerusalem municipality and the families. They haven't paid rent. It's just like an eviction lawsuit in the Circuit Court of Cook County over here in Chicago. I mean, just trivializing what is taking place. We're talking about ethnic cleansing of an indigenous population. We're talking about occupation. We're talking about apartheid. I mean, it's interesting that Rashida's letter, you know, quotes and cites the Human Rights Watch report, a threshold crossed, the 2004 advisory opinion from the ICJ, Bet Selam. I mean, we're talking about human rights organizations that detail with so much information Israel's abuses and human rights violations. But sometimes I feel I get stuck because of the media narrative that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. How can creating a Jewish home for a Jewish family be a war crime? How is that even possible? How can people fathom that? So how do you address, obviously not the public that is aware of what's going on, but the majority of Americans who are not aware of what's going on? Even if the tide is shifting, I still feel like we have a long way to go. And is there any tips, anything that you can say to help bring about that reality that you do have an asymmetrical situation there between colonizer and colonized? And anybody can really tackle that. Diala, I mean, I focused on the legality a little bit here, so we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your point about the challenge of accurately representing what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, I think that's I don't want to overstate this, but I really think that there is a sort of sea change that's happening now as Palestinians on social media are able to just reframe the narratives in ways that are so much more effective than anything we've seen in the last, I don't know, ever since I started paying attention. And so I just want to uplift that. I don't think that like all is lost. I do actually think that there are really significant strides that have been made, and that our role is to keep pushing and to keep amplifying, you know, the voices of those who are, you know, in the eye of the storm. And I do think it is in part a narrative battle, even on the legal front, right? Like when I was talking about these organizations' self-description as redeeming the land, right? For example, like what does that actually mean? And explaining to folks like, well, redeeming the land actually means overtly, right, transferring the land from Palestinian possession to Jewish-only possession, right? This is how the settler movement has used that term. And so if you are looking at the like lovely description in the 990 forms or whatever they put on their websites to describe what their charities are doing, you know, it's important to say, well, this is actually what that looks like on the ground. Similarly, you know, you raise the property dispute point. Of course, it's not a mere property dispute or a real estate dispute, unless you want to get into like critical legal theory and talk about how all real estate disputes are actually forms of power, right? Whether it's in New Jersey, New York, and gentrification, or in Palestine, but obviously with all sorts of local nuances. But that's a much longer conversation to be had. At the end of the day, it is not just like a landlord evicting a tenant. It is an exercise of power. And who has access to that power, and who controls the courts, and whose courts, you know, and who is represented by the polity that those courts purport to be sort of acting on behalf of. You know, the JNF has basically managed the Jewish National Fund, right? The sort of, and this is, you know, we're not talking about settlements at this point. We're talking about the sort of fundamentals of how the state of Israel was established, right? It was through the vehicle of so-called charitable giving, through the what we now or have, you know, people have described as greenwashing of planting trees, but we all understand to actually be a form of laying your hands on the land. This, you know, and what the JNF has done is basically plant trees on the sites of ethnically cleansed village or in strategic locations, in order to obfuscate, you know, the Nakba, basically. And that was all done through the vehicle of charity. And so I think we do have a lot of narrative work to reframe what these organizations have been very successfully, you know, misframing as do good work, important environmental work, or socially conscious work. But that's a narrative battle, primarily a narrative battle, and I think that's one that is possible to kind of do a lot more in. And we also have to be incredibly precise when we talk about these groups and what they do and what we're talking about, because we don't have the luxury of fudging things. We don't have the luxury of overstating or misrepresenting. And I think that's another challenge that we have here. But again, when we talk about these organizations, they're so blatant in their missions and in their roles and in their affiliations that it's not that hard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just want to stress one point. You know, I did notice two things that I think are you know, of extreme magnitude in the last 2 years. Was in a presidential debate, you can have a discussion on BDS. I mean, in 2008 or 9, you know, a few years into BDS work, I didn't even think that was even fathomable. The fact that you can just have the discussion on it, and that you can openly call Israel an apartheid state and not get the kind of backlash that you would have gotten just 3-4 years ago. So, I mean, obviously, I think the narrative is shifting for the better. Rasha, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just everything that Diana mentioned, but also keeping folks informed on like next steps on what to expect, and really being able to take it back to the drawing boards on what this means. I mean, I don't know if I'm geeking out or what, but like just even listening here and manifesting what this could be for, even though this has been an ongoing battle for years. But I think taking it back to the drawing board and being able to just contextualize it in its simplest forms, that like when you give to a nonprofit organization, usually it is to relief and provide relief and alleviation for marginalized communities and groups across the country, and even many times globally, right, within 501c3 status. So if you're able to take it back to the drawing boards and to just being able to connect the dots of how this is actually doing quite the opposite, and people trust that 501c3 statuses protect that. And yeah, and I would just add that people are powerfully connecting the dots right now globally, within the US and outside the US borders. And while this is an exhausting time for the Palestinian liberation movement, I think that this is actually a time for opportunity, for how, you know, every aspect of the movement, whether it's grassroots organizing, legal, people in congressional or the halls of Congress that need to come together, but also continuing to center the most marginalized, which is folks that are on the ground. So absolutely, I think that this is just an opportune time. And I think that this is going to open the doors for so many, not just discussions and education, but what can lead to another angle and aspect of how, you know, we get free. And I think that being able to just really provide material, talking points, language, and breakdowns of what this means can go a long way.
Lara, we always started with you. We'll end with you on this question.
Thanks, and I like both of the previous answers, so I'll associate myself with those. I do think, you know, I tend to, if people who know me, I went echoing. I tend to be sort of pessimistic, and I want to say, actually, I think there's reason to be hopeful right now. I think there is a narrative shift going on. I think it's terrifying, the people who want to support status quo policies, and status quo policies are not status quo, right? They're moving us in the direction of permanent Israeli control across all the land and dispossession of Palestinians. Those have been the policies for decades, and I think there is a narrative shift that is challenging that in a way that we've never seen before. I think, though, that there's energizing on both sides, right? And so you have to be aware, for folks who are organizing and engaged, this is a moment when it's playing both offense and defense. And, you know, Diala and I have spent a lot of time talking together over the past few years about the efforts to use legislation to quash all activism around Israel, Palestine, and free speech, right? Ben & Jerry's has brought to the fore people's attention, right, to the anti-boycott laws, which are basically anti-free speech laws, which, by the way, are being repurposed now in multiple states to be anti-activism targeting the firearms and ammunition industry, or anti-activism targeting the gas and oil industry, right? If you carve out a free speech exception for one thing, it's really easy to repurpose it for something else. We also have the continuing energy around the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is going to get a lot of spotlight right now because Biden has just announced his new nominee. That is an incredibly insidious effort to take what is a huge, real problem. I say this as a Jewish American. There's a real problem of surging anti-Semitism. That should not be mistaken for an excuse to clamp down on free speech critical of Israel, but that's what it's becoming. And that really is very threatening. And I think, you know, playing both defense and offense is necessary. And I think it actually fits together because some of when I try to explain to people, you know, why this IHRA definition is so problematic, really the strongest answer is listen to Palestinians, right? Don't listen to me, listen to Palestinians, listen to the Palestinian experience here in the United States, listen to the Palestinians on the ground, and understand what it's like to have this sort of illiberal spear pointed at you. And then you can also worry about the broader implications for the free speech of people who have all sorts of privilege, who are suddenly realizing that that privilege is threatened as well. I think this is really a moment to feel energized about the opportunity, but also to feel energized because as this opportunity approaches, the people who want to deny that opportunity are getting more energized as well.
Can I jump in real quick on just to tie to something that Lara just said, which is to these organizations, right? It might come as no surprise to you all and the folks listening in that not only are these settler foundations, groups like the Central Fund of Israel, funding directly groups on the ground, Israeli nonprofits that are moving forward the settlement enterprise, but they're also increasingly funding groups like Im Tirtzu, Stand With Us, the Kohelet Policy Forum. All of these are the organizations and the groups that are behind pushing for this legislation, behind the lawfare, which is basically the efforts to attack Palestinian advocacy in U.S. courts and in Europe and elsewhere. This is all part and parcel of the same effort, right? You're not going to be able to appropriately execute the settlement enterprise and expansion and apartheid project if you're not also able to silence the critics of that project. And if you look at the docket, the grantees of these foundations, it is like proof of that analysis in and of itself, right? So it's not just the settlement, structures that are being built or like the rent for someone like Jacob Fauci, but it's also the people who are developing the legal arguments that are then being used to silence, folks in the US who are speaking out against those groups. And just to like tie it all together.
That's great. Thank you, Diala. And I think that this is all great in that it brings us back to the center, and just when we talk about the US as an institution in all of its form, it comes back to this issue that the US is enabling and abetting all of this. Israel and these Israeli settlement groups and nonprofits on the ground would not be able to function and would not be able to succeed without the support of private actors here, the support of the US government, the support of corporations here, creating the weaponry, creating the bulldozers that take the settlements down. All of it is so incredibly interconnected. So while I'm being cognizant of our time here, we have a few minutes left. Really quickly, if we can just talk about, we talked about how the narrative is shifting, the tide is shifting. We're getting somewhere. We still have a long way to go, but we're getting somewhere in terms of being able to openly talk about it and not get as much, lashback as we used to even a couple of years ago. So as Americans, I feel like we have some kind of duty considering, our institution is enabling this. So what more can we do beyond what we've been doing the last few months, especially? What more can we do in terms of the 501c3 organizations, whether it's the corporations themselves, donors, grassroots leaders on the ground, activists? What more should we be doing in order to get the knowledge out and also to keep pushing the momentum? And anybody could begin. We'll go with Rasha or Lara. Okay.
Honestly, very, very quickly, look, setting aside the question of whether or not there's a legal basis for asking for their 501c3 status to be stripped from them, and I think that is dicey, as I've made clear. I think there's enormous power in naming and shaming. I think getting the information out there, when people understand that, there's a large cohort right now that sees what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and says, wow, this is really terrible, right? And a few people have written about the role of American actors in behind the scenes building to where we are today in Sheikh Jarrah. That's an incredibly powerful story. Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah have incredibly strong American elements to them. Hebron has an incredibly strong American element to it. I don't think that'll necessarily prevent the funding going. And I want to be very honest. I think stripping the 501c3 status won't prevent the funding going. I don't think the kind of millionaires and whatever who are donating to build settlements in Hebron, I don't think the tax exempt status is what makes them do it. It does, though, it offers an opportunity to draw some attention to it. I think that has value. And honestly, I think it almost hasn't been tried enough, but it has to be done very carefully. This isn't about people being Jewish. It's not about organizations being run by Jews. This is about the activities that they are engaging in and supporting on the ground and the human rights and international law violations that they involve. And by the way, I think you have to widen your net to evangelical groups who are playing a massive role in this as well. This is not strictly a question of Jewish NGOs. This is evangelical NGOs. It goes much, much more broadly. And I think, again, that calling it out and shedding light on it could have a really valuable impact.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that insight. Rasha, you can go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think what we are seeing is the Zionist movement co-opting movement language, movement tactics, right? So also cautioning people that if we're not careful, that what we're also seeing is not, like, to Lara's point, it's not just these NGOs. It's a lot of the time social justice orgs and advocacy groups, right, that are receiving this kind of funding that is meant to ostracize the Palestinian movement out of these spaces, right? So also just notifying folks that even just like how we've seen with the anti-BDS bills and the anti-Semitism bills historically in the state of Florida, right? Like, we've seen all sides of the aisle unanimously pass these laws in. And now Florida's facing HB1 anti-protest bill, where that came out of post-George Floyd protests, but also we do have a racist governor, DeSantis, but in reality is that getting folks to understand, if they come for one group, for one community, right? Like, these anti-protest bills, not new. They've historically been being passed on a resolution level in the state of Florida that has led to this anti-protest bill that's very severely anti-Black, right? So getting folks to understand that if these settler organizations are being able to fly under the radar, that there will be other groups and organizations that will demoralize and unethically really target other groups of people here in the U.S. and other places around the world. And I also think, just to y'all, I think Lara and Diala, you spoke to it a little bit too, is just like the offense and defense. It's being able to find a balance, right, of how involved you are in this work, and having a balance of not allowing the defense aspect of it redirect your resources, your energy, your funding in that sense. So being able to just stay focused, finding where you land in this work to be free as Palestinians and diaspora, but as all marginalized groups, is being able to find where your place is and providing support in other spaces. So it is difficult, because many times we are being attacked, right? And so we find ourselves redirecting organizationally or individually with our resources and our energy. So being able to just find that balance in this work too.
Thank you, Rasha. That's a really good reminder that I think anybody passionate about this work constantly needs to hear. Diala.
And I'll be really brief. I just think that the 501c3 issue and these settlement foundations is a really, as Lara said, great inroad to talking to people more about what we have become more accustomed to hearing about, which is like the issues of the purse, right? Like, where is our money going? What could it be spent on? And looking sort of at these direct connections, right? Looking at sort of the immediacy between like U.S. action, whether it's private or public, and acts on the ground. And so I think, following the lead of folks who've of the defund movement and Black-led organizations who are saying, like, let's look at budgets, let's look at what we're doing with our government money, what we're giving the seal of approval to by bestowing 501c3 status and by bestowing a certain kind of place, right? And recognition to, like, is something that resonates with people. And so, like, I think doing more of that as a part of the public education is really important. I also agree that, even if we succeeded in removing the 501c3 status from an organization like Central Fund of Israel, that's not going to stop the millions annually to the settlement project, because this isn't actually This isn't about a budget calculus for those donors, right? They're ideologically motivated. They're very clear about their goals. So it's really a vehicle through which we can be thinking about like how exposing how US actors are sort of directly involved, and then calling for accountability. In terms of what people should be doing, I think that there's so much sort of untapped opportunity here to elevate this with your representatives, with your local officials who have some kind of authority to even just like look into these organizations, right? Folks might be familiar with Breaking the Silence. It's an Israeli organization that is the former military IDF folks who are sort of breaking their silence around the human rights violations that they committed while they were in service. And they always talk about how the strategy of the Israeli military is to make them feel chaste, right? To make Palestinians feel chaste. And I think that a part of how we should be thinking about, if we're talking about offense, defense here, is how do we make these organizations that are so openly, brazenly violating the law feel somewhat chaste? And that can be done through exposure and sunlight, because they clearly don't really want that. And that can also be done, through various methods. So thinking through like what we have access to as a movement, and what authorities we may be able to sort of invoke is a big part of the work that needs to be done, I think.
Thank you all so much for your participation in this, and the human element in all of this. Sometimes I feel like gets lost, especially in our media discourse and our political discourse. There are families, there are children that are directly affected by this. Seeing their father, pulled out from Israeli authorities, 3 a.m., waking up the whole family, grandmothers, watching soldiers come in, break the bed, go through their personal belongings. I mean, just the level of embarrassment, the level of dehumanization that is involved with this process. I think that is something that needs to definitely be highlighted, and that's something that I will try to emphasize on this Friday during our 11th educational webinar. I'll be interviewing Jody Sokolower, who authored a book titled "Determined to Stay: Palestinian Youth Fight for Their Village." It's a phenomenal book, phenomenal read, that just goes into the personal stories of people in Silwan, especially children, and what they go through and how these organizations carry out their ethnic cleansing campaigns and how it impacts them directly. And, it's a lot of sad stories, but that human element, I believe, is necessary to really, really drive home the point to the American public. And there's the advertisement for that webinar. I hope you all tune in for it. It's a phenomenal book. She's a phenomenal author, and it'll be a phenomenal event. Aya, I'll defer to you to close us out. Thank you all very much, by the way.
Yeah, thank you, Tariq, for bringing up the webinar. You can find that on our Facebook page and RSVP there. And bringing in Silwan, I wouldn't be the advocacy director if I didn't end this with some action items. So 2 things. If you go to ampalestine.org and you go to our advocacy page, you'll find an action alert, the most recent one, that has to do with the letter that Representative Rashida Tlaib sent out a couple weeks ago. There's some sample tweets there, tweeting at Secretary Yellen, urging her to, respond to Rashida's letter and open up an investigation on these 501c3 organizations. And also, it's August, and AMP, as well as other organizations, have built a coalition pushing Jerusalem Action Month, considering, again, we spoke earlier about how critical of a time it is for East Jerusalem, for Silwan, for Sheikh Jarrah. Yesterday was the case for Mohammed al-Qud's family. So there's some very big court cases happening this month, a lot of settlement pushes happening this month, and the least that we could be doing is raising awareness. So also, if you go to ampalestine.org, to our Instagram, to our Facebook page, you'll find the toolkit in there pushing for Jerusalem Action Month, and we'll be sending out more action items as the week passed by. But I just want to thank you all so much. This was very insightful. I really hope that everybody tuning into this webinar walks away with some new knowledge and is motivated to continue fighting, to continue educating yourself on this issue and educating those around you. Thank you all for being here today.